Welcome to a new episode of The Untold with me, Hevi Buzo. A lot to talk about in today's episode. A new era in the Middle East following historical peace deals, the Abraham Accords between Israel, UAE, Bahrain, and the new peace deal between Israel and Sudan. Also, we will talk about the big Iran question, the Iranian regime's threats to the entire Middle East region, our national security, and the security of the entire world, in my opinion. And finally, we will discuss the implications of the ongoing US presidential elections on US foreign policy and the Middle East in particular. Joining us to talk about all of these very important topics is Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, FDD. FDD is a nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C. that is focused on national security and foreign policy. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
You are also on the leadership team of FDD Center on Economic and Financial Power. Tell us more about how do you think the Abraham Accords will help the regional countries involved economically?
Well, it's a good question, and I think we're already seeing some significant progress with the UAE and Israel in particular. We've seen the Abraham Fund be created. It's $3 billion where you will see Emirati investment in Israel. There are, of course, all sorts of ways where Israel can help contribute using its technological prowess, its advancements in medicine, in agriculture. These are all things that I think we expect to see between the UAE and Israel. The question now is, with Bahrain, will they be following suit with similar agreements? And then I think more importantly is looking at what happens with Sudan. This is a country that is in dire need of assistance right now from anyone who will be able to provide it. They're roughly $60 billion in debt. Now, of course, some of the assistance has already come in from the United States. We've heard reportedly that there could be pledges from the UAE and others, but they're the ones who really need those solutions that the Israelis have in terms of agriculture and technology and medicine. This is a country that has fallen very far behind as a result of the 30 plus years of the Omar al-Bashir regime. And so they've got a lot of work to do in terms of catching up to the modern era.
So when you talk about the distinction between the peace deal with UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan, where is Bahrain today and where's Sudan? Because we know that in Sudan, there was some disputes also between some branches of their new government, even though the people in Sudan seem to be very enthusiastic about having peace, obviously being removed from the terrorist list. But there were those disputes, and Bahrain also was going all the way in, but then it wasn't as probably we didn't see the progress that we saw with UAE. Where are those two countries in terms of these differences?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would say that the UAE looks like the gold standard right now. It is what warm peace should look like in the region. And unfortunately, it's not what we see with countries like Egypt or Jordan that have these longstanding agreements with Israel, but they have not been particularly warm or necessarily particularly beneficial beyond the security relationship that exists, which is, by the way, nothing to sneeze at, but still not quite as advanced or far along as one might hope. So the UAE is the gold standard. I think with Sudan, you're absolutely right. There are divisions within the government. The prime minister is a bit less enthusiastic about the deal, while the chairman of the Sovereignty Council or the military appears far more engaged with Israel. And so you have this division within the country. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the government itself was an Islamist government. It was a Muslim Brotherhood government that was friendly with Iran, friendly with Al-Qaeda and other malign actors across the region. There are still people in Sudan that identify with these ideologies and still see Israel as an enemy. So I think this is the kind of agreement that we would like to see evolve over time into something that's warmer and more beneficial. But again, I see real room to run for Sudan, given the many needs that it has and given the many solutions that Israel could offer. Bahrain, I think you rightly note, is a country that's somewhere in the middle. I think it's certainly far further along than Sudan, but not far along enough where we would say that it's in that same group as the UAE. What's interesting about all of that, though, is that Bahrain has been the country that has been arguably more forward-leaning historically over the last couple of years in terms of its outreach with Israel, in terms of sort of saying the right things and indicating that it was willing to leave some of these old animosities behind. So it's not clear to me exactly what the holdup is. But I always did believe, as we've watched these Gulf states, that there would be kind of a process where one country would lead the way and the others would watch for a while to see whether there was any domestic blowback, to see whether there would be any fallout within their population. And then if there was not, then it would be a green light for others to move forward. So Bahrain may be just watching the UAE to see where things go. And by the way, I think other countries like Saudi Arabia, they're also watching and could take their cue.
Exactly. And that's where we're going to probably be going next. But I do kind of want to talk about the economical aspect, because this is very important. Oil in the world is a source of energy that is probably no longer is the main source. The world is shifting away from it. There are a lot of need for what Israel could offer the region. And we're starting to see some deals that are being established. And we, saw that in the medical field, like Hadassah is one of Israel's biggest hospitals, and it's very renowned worldwide. And now there are talks probably that this hospital will open in Dubai. What other things or economical deals that could actually help both countries and any other country that could be involved in having these type of economical cooperation and relations?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's virtually, endless when you think about the sorts of things that Israel has been innovating over the years. They're leaders in a wide range of technologies, and this has, of course, attracted the attention of the United States and even China over the years. And the UAE has significant funds to spend on joint ventures. And so, again, we've already seen $3 billion worth allocated, and who knows where that goes. But the Sovereign Wealth Fund of the UAE is run by very smart people, and they have a record of success, and they are undoubtedly eyeing Israel's tech sector. It's Israel's known as the startup nation, and so I think lots of opportunities there. There's also the question of agricultural technology. The Israelis are pioneers in the drip irrigation technique that has transformed parts of Israel from desert into agricultural powerhouses. So you have an opportunity there for the UAE, a very arid environment that could benefit from Israeli cooperation. Israel is also adept in the cyberspace as well, and you can imagine that the UAE would love to be able to access some of Israel's cyber solutions. There's the military technology that Israel has developed over time. Now, this one is going to be a little bit more sensitive because Israel is still very wary of sharing some of its high-tech military solutions in the region. This is, of course, stemming from Israel's desire to maintain what it calls a qualitative military edge, or QME, as we call it in Washington. This QME is something that Israel views as necessary, no matter who the partners could potentially be. In other words, when this was originally conceived, there was only one country at the time, this is in the 1980s, that had made peace with Israel, and is still a cold peace. That was Egypt. But now you've got other countries that are signing on, but Israel still believes that it needs to maintain the better weapons, and really the best possible weapons relative to everyone else in the region, whether they are friend or foe. So that one area might be still an area of some tension with the UAE, but I think with everything else, we're seeing lots of room to run.
And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a little bit, but talking about the peace deals, what countries are we expecting to join the peace deals next? There are talks about Morocco, Oman. Who do you think will be next?
Well, I think Oman is the easiest to imagine, because we've already seen that the former Sultan of Oman met with Bibi Netanyahu. I guess it was earlier this year. It seems like a decade ago. But we've had a change in leadership in Oman. The former Sultan passed away. We have a new one, and so it'll be interesting to see how quickly the Omanis move forward. But the Omanis, they call themselves the Switzerland of the Middle East. They have peace with everybody. They have relations with everybody. So it would not be difficult to imagine this.
But that's including Iran.
It is including Iran, and it's been a source of tension for the other Gulf states. But from Israel's perspective, I think the Israelis view the Omanis as an asset, perhaps as a country that can pass messages on to Iran, or that can help broker things through the rest of the region. Of course, that's what the United States did with Oman during the Iran nuclear talks as well. So Oman understands its role in the region, and I think would be probably willing to play it with Israel as well. So that's one to watch. Morocco is another one. The Israeli officials that I talked to have said that there have been a number of false starts over the years where Morocco was ready to make a deal with Israel. It's a bit of an outlier within the Arab world. It really sees itself as a North African state with strong ties to Europe. And so there was certainly the potential in the past, and I see no reason why Morocco may not move forward. I think a big question right now on that one, and it's really interesting, they are looking for recognition by the United States for their control over the Western Sahara, which is so fascinating because it is a territorial conflict, not unlike the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And they are asking for the US recognition of what is commonly referred to as their occupation of the Western Sahara. So that's an interesting wrinkle. I have no idea where the US stands on this, but I know that this has been at least part of the discussion there. And then I would say the big prize, of course, would be Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has been certainly warming toward Israel. They're now allowing for Israeli flights to go over their territory. They've taken other steps, in terms of dialing back on their Wahhabi outreach. They have the Muslim World League that has recognized the Holocaust. So there are lots of things that are happening right now that are positive indicators. But having been to Saudi and talked to Saudi leaders, my sense is that they're going to be more conservative. That's what everybody always says about the Saudi kingdom, that it is a conservative government in the Gulf, and that is absolutely the case. I think they want to wait and see how this all plays out.
What are they waiting to see? Because we know, and everybody knows, that there are those relations. It's pretty obvious to everybody, including the fact that Bahrain wouldn't be able to make peace with Israel without the Saudi approval.
Correct.
But what is Saudi Arabia waiting for at this point?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Saudi Arabia is using Bahrain and to a certain extent the UAE as a trial balloon to see how things would go in those countries, how they're accepted by the other Arab states, what the blowback might be with the Palestinians, whether there's domestic unrest as a result of these sorts of deals. I think that's part of what they're watching here. But then there's also another question, which I think is also very interesting, which is, the UAE, right? They're making a play for the F-35, and they're looking for other ways that they may be able to benefit through negotiations with the United States. The Saudis have a very uneasy relationship right now with the United States because of Yemen, and also really because of Jamal Khashoggi. And so this is the kind of scenario where the Saudis may not be able to really make real advances with the US government until some of these other issues are ironed out. So it may be that there is an ongoing discussion about how to settle some of these core challenges once and for all. And I think we're going to have to wait and see what happens with the election because the Democratic government may be less willing than a Republican government to deal with that.
Because I kind of want to run all the countries. Qatar is another country that there are talks about, that there could be a peace agreement. But, Qatar, we know that has a long history of funding Islamic extremists. Al Jazeera is a channel that has been promoting extremism in the region and hate towards Israel and anti-Semitism for decades. How would that play out?
I don't think it will. I think that there are ties that exist between the Qatari government and the Israeli government, primarily because Qatar is the primary sponsor of the Hamas-led government in the Gaza Strip, and the Israelis have basically decided to hold their nose, working with the Qataris to make sure that funding gets through to the government and to try to keep a lid on violence. But at the end of the day, the Israelis know exactly who the Qataris are, and that is that they are sponsors of the Muslim Brotherhood, sponsors of Hamas. They've provided assistance to Al Qaeda and ISIS and the Taliban. This is not a government that the Israelis trust. And I think also there is a sense of agreement among the other Gulf states that Israel has warmed to, that Qatar is part of the problem, not part of the solution in the region. So these warm ties that we see with the UAE, I mean, I would say that in some ways they were fostered by two things. One was the Iran nuclear deal. This was one source of agreement, but the other one was their mutual disdain and alarm for the Muslim Brotherhood and what was happening during the Arab Spring, beginning in 2011 through, let's say, 2014 or 15. So I think there is already a sense in Israel that Qatar is up to no good and that they would not be a particularly great peace partner. There could be some pressure from the United States to move forward with yet another deal, kind of another notch for the Trump administration. But I think the Israelis will show great hesitancy because of Qatar's record of terror finance and support for extremist groups.
Exactly. What about Kuwait? And that will be the last country to ask about, because that's another country where there's a movement over there that is anti-peace, very vocal. Some of it is also being said that is leaning towards Iran. So there are concerns about like where Kuwait stands. And even though it's a historical ally of the United States, and the United States defended Kuwait against Iraq, and we know that the majority of the Palestinians actually stood with Saddam Hussein against Kuwait during these wars.
Yeah, Kuwait's a complicated ally. I would say it's probably the least grateful ally in the modern era for American intervention. There wouldn't be a Kuwait if the United States had not led that intervention to oust Saddam Hussein. But nevertheless, their anti-American sentiment runs very high in that country. The parliament is a freewheeling one where anti-Israel and anti-American sentiment is thrown around. We've seen a terror finance problem in Kuwait. That's one of the jurisdictions that we continue to watch other than Qatar in the Persian Gulf. And so, you know, they're problematic. I would just say that the rambunctious nature of the political discourse there would make it extremely difficult for now to imagine a peace deal. But I do think that in general, the influence of the UAE deal and Bahrain could ultimately prevail upon the Kuwaitis. They may realize that there are benefits to be gleaned either by Israel or by the United States. And I think they also understand that Israel is not really their enemy, that Israel is not out to destroy Kuwait, and that the Arab-Israeli conflict, such as we knew it anyway, is really starting to unravel, and holding on to these ancient hatreds probably not helpful at the end of the day. So I think there's hope, but I would say let's not hold our breath. It might take a while.
I do want to move to Iran. After 4 years of the Trump administration, in the maximum pressure campaign, where does Iran stand today?
Iran's in a lot of trouble. Economically, they continue to be battered by U.S. sanctions. The rial is, just dropping, and unemployment is high. The Iranian government's handling of the COVID-19 crisis has been a disaster. It really lacks legitimacy right now. The government lacks legitimacy across the board. But what's really interesting is that they appear not to have given up on this revolutionary ideology, and the government that has embraced it. I do think, though, that they're really waiting and watching this election here in the United States. If Trump wins, then they may have no choice but to return to the negotiating table and to swallow their pride and to engage with Donald Trump. If Biden wins, I think they might see it as a sign of life for their regime, because at least there are some advisors within the Biden camp that have indicated their willingness to maybe return to the 2015 nuclear deal that afforded Iran all that sanctions relief and breathing room. But I would say that even if we reach a scenario where there's negotiation or sanctions relief on some level, the government is still in a lot of trouble. The people, I think, really have a sense now of how cynical this government has been, how it has deprioritized its own people, and instead prioritized this very aggressive regional approach to sponsoring groups like Hezbollah and Hamas and the Hashd al-Shabi, the popular mobilization units in Iraq and Syria. This is where they're spending their time and their effort, not building up capacity at home.
I mean, they're absolutely against Trump winning the elections, because we saw yesterday that they were trying to influence the elections. There was 27 online platforms that are Iranians, and the US basically, shut them down, but they were trying to influence the elections.
That's right. And I think we could certainly ask questions about how effective that was or wasn't. And I would love to see a post-mortem of that when the elections are done. And it certainly sounds like America's cyber warriors had to go on the counteroffensive in order to neutralize some of Iran's activities. Let's just say there's no question about what Iran wanted in this election. And I think it's also at this point no question that the cyber realm is one where Iran feels increasingly comfortable, that they're willing to take risks and to go on the offensive, to engage in a cyber war, as it's known, against the United States. By the way, they've also done it in Israel. They tried to attack Israel's water carrier and very nearly succeeded. So we need to continue to watch that. But I think all of that is an indication, that Iran is still willing to engage in malign activity and aggressive activity all across the region, even as their people are suffering at home. And again, this is not lost on the Iranian people. The protests that we've seen over the last year plus have all shown that the Iranian people are very frustrated at the allocation of resources that this regime has chosen, right? That they're spending money on rockets in Gaza and Lebanon and popular mobilization units in Syria and Iraq, rather than treating COVID at home, rather than bolstering their economy at home. And this is what makes the regime brittle. It's what makes maximum pressure all the more effective, in my view. Right? And now there's still room to run in terms of American sanctions, but we continue to pile them on, and we continue to look for ways to pressure this regime. And that is the right strategy, because the Middle East right now, as we just discussed, appears to be moving in a much better direction, where countries have finally given up on some of these ancient hatreds. And here you have Iran trying to keep them alive.
Exactly. And I want to talk about what would the outcome of this presidential election mean to the Middle East. And if you would allow for us to talk a little bit about, what a Biden administration would look like in terms of policies toward the Middle East versus a Trump administration. We can start with Iran. In your opinion, what would Biden administration do about, the maximum pressure campaign that is proven successful against the Iranian regime? Because it is much weaker, the regime is much weaker. We can see it all around, though the aggression continues in countries like Iraq. What would the Biden administration do about the maximum pressure campaign? And the second and the most important question would be the nuclear question.
Yeah, I think all good questions. The first thing that I always like to remember with Joe Biden is that he is a centrist Democrat. The concern that I think some have is that there are elements within the Democratic Party that would love to push that foreign policy further to the left, which would mean a more accommodationist policy toward the Iranians. And this is the concern. I should say, actually, the Iranian regime, not the Iranian people. And so you have those that are going to advocate for a full return to the JCPOA, to the 2015 nuclear deal, a full return to sanctions relief, and other policies that would probably help or benefit the regime in Iran. This is, it's a concern, but it is by no means a foregone conclusion. You have to remember that even during the Obama years, right, we saw two different policies. One was, I would say, maximum pressure, right? They were using sanctions, some very heavy sanctions, including sanctions on the SWIFT system of banking that really blocked Iran from accessing the US-led financial system. This is this was part of the Obama administration policy. And then there was the second half, which was more accommodationist and engaging with the regime, providing the regime with sanctions relief and giving it an opportunity to breathe a bit. And so there is, I think, a real question about which Biden we would see. But again, I think a lot of that does have to do with who he chooses as his advisors and who is influencing the White House if in fact he wins.
Okay, so a question mark, even though we kind of heard some comments about the Biden administration would want to, go back to negotiations with Iran, entering a new nuclear deal. What do you think will happen there?
I have no idea. I really don't. I mean, we have seen, we've or at least we've heard about, white papers floating around advocating for, a direct reentry. We've heard others talk about trying to renegotiate a different deal, one that might potentially be, involve some of the regional activity and the malign behavior that we've seen that go beyond the nuclear scope, which would, by the way, be very welcome. There's also a question of, whether a deal might be brought to the Senate in the form of a treaty, which, by the way, is something that Donald Trump could pursue. There's also a question now about including the other players in the region for something, that would look like a new or different peace deal that would try to put an end to all of the issues that everyone in the region has been dealing with. But the biggest challenge I think we all face in kind of gaming this out is that if Iran were to agree to some of these core issues and would bring an end to this activity, would it still be the Iranian regime that we know? And so there is, kind of a core question about what Iran is capable of doing. And I think, unfortunately, right now, I don't see this as a regime that is willing to accommodate the United States or any of the other actors in the region, other than maybe a handful of countries that it already sees as proxies or partners.
The idea of the Iranian regime becoming just a completely different entity is just not realistic one. I mean, this is an Islamic regime, a revolutionary one too.
That's right. A leopard does not change its spots. And again, we know what this regime wants. It wants domination. It wants to fulfill its vision of that Shiite crescent, as we call it. It wants proxies to dominate in places like Lebanon and Syria and Iraq. It wants to create unrest in places like Israel, wants to destroy Israel. It wants to create unrest in Bahrain. It wants to challenge the countries of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. These are all things that were not addressed the last time around and should have been. This is the main criticism that I think many of us had about the JCPOA from 2015, that we shouldn't be giving the world's foremost state sponsor of terror and the country that has been most responsible for destabilizing the region, we shouldn't be giving it anything until all of these behaviors stop. And so really the question is, will a future Biden administration, if there is one, will they return to that old model, or do they start to think about bringing in some of these other issues that should have been addressed the first time around?
Yes, I want to go back actually and talk about the biggest fear in the Middle East from a Biden administration would be the disengagement in the region. And we saw this is what happened when the Biden-Obama administration withdrew from Iraq, which actually basically was the main cause of the rise of ISIS.
Right.
So the disengagement would be the biggest concern for these countries, knowing that the Iranian regime is still hanging in there, waiting for the opportunity to become as aggressive as it used to be or was with the Obama administration being in the White House. Is that a lesson that was learned by Biden?
I don't think it was. I think the problem that we see right now is a trend of isolationism across both parties. And this is something really that we need to watch. It's, I think, a very dangerous trend in American politics. I mean, they try to use different words now, like restraint, that we need a more restrained American foreign policy, or that we need to end what they call forever wars, or that we need to pivot to China. At the end of the day, we have actually a very light footprint in the Middle East. The U.S. military has small numbers in Syria, relatively small numbers in Iraq. We continue to draw down in Afghanistan. We've got multinational forces that we lead in the Sinai Peninsula. And of course, we have our naval footprint as we patrol the region. We've got some bases in Bahrain and UAE and elsewhere. But the point being is that this is not major deployments at this point, but we still see analysts and politicians calling for a complete evacuation of American forces, a drawdown. And I don't think it's healthy. It's probably not healthy for the region. It will look like a green light to Iran or to Sunni jihadi forces that they'll have more room to run. Look, I think it's also important for a lot of these players to note that America still has an interest in the region. Maybe it's not as intense as it was after 9/11, but that we still would like to be the predominant world power. And by the way, it's also, a means of keeping China out, of keeping Russia out of the region. In other words, if we still want to shape that part of the world, if we still want a role to play, we can't leave lock, stock, and barrel. And that's, unfortunately, we're hearing that there are voices on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat alike. I mean, we could be just as critical of a Trump administration's attempts to leave Afghanistan in its entirety and to leave that country to the Taliban. It could have similar disastrous effects akin to what we saw with the departure from Iraq and the rise of ISIS.
Exactly. In terms of the peace deals that we saw happening, what do you imagine the Biden administration's position on that? Because we also saw that Tony Blinken, who is the foreign policy advisor to Biden, said that, for example, in terms of selling the advanced F-35 fighter jets to UAE, that this is something concerning to the Biden administration, but it's not only to a Biden administration. Also, others seems to be concerned about this issue here in Washington. You and Jacob Nagel from the FDD, you guys wrote a piece in Newsweek about this issue. And you mentioned the example of countries like Turkey, who is in theory a US ally, but at the same time with the Erdogan government, we saw how Turkey went towards Russia, bought the S-400s, and they tested American technology on Russian weaponry. I mean, there's a lot of violations to what an ally should be doing. And given that there's the China element right now, how could the United States make sure that nothing like this could happen in the future, where there's sophisticated technology and American weaponry could be used by our adversaries or enemies?
Look, you're asking a lot of important questions here, and I think in general, the Israelis have been, I think, worn down a little bit by the United States. It's very tempting right now for the U.S. to want to sell 50 F-35 aircraft and really, bring in a bunch of money during a very uncertain economic time here in the United States. So these are big ticket items, and you can imagine it's very tempting. On the other hand, I think as Jacob Nagel noted, and actually we had a piece yesterday that came out in Newsweek where we talk about the Middle East deals that have gone wrong in the past. You mentioned Turkey. That was one where we dodged the bullet because we removed Turkey from the F-35 program before they received those aircraft, and that was because of the S-400, as you mentioned, that Russian system. But just think about what happened in Egypt in 2012 when Mohamed Morsi came to power with a large fleet of American F-16s sitting on those airfields. They could have very easily been turned into enemy aircraft if the Muslim Brotherhood had remained in power and decided to adopt an anti-Israel or an anti-American posture. Even today, we look at the Iranian Air Force, and it is made up a large number of F-4s, American aircraft, that we sold before the regime was overthrown, the Shah's regime was overthrown. So, what you have right now is a situation where friendly countries can and sometimes become unfriendly countries overnight. And I think there are lessons to learn from all of that. And Jacob and I, when we looked at the alternatives, I think, look, there are other advanced systems that can be sold without changing the balance of power. Yeah, and the China issue, I think, is an important one. There is a great power competition that's underway. The Chinese are doing everything they can to steal American intellectual property, and in particular, to get their hands on advanced American military technology. And in some cases, they're looking at artificial intelligence and quantum computing and other things in what we would commonly call the tech realm. But just imagine if they were able to get their hands on the F-35. I mean, they already have their sort of version of a stealth aircraft, but as we understand it, really doesn't hold a candle to the United States F-35 and the program that we've worked on with our allies. But these are exactly the sorts of concerns that have been raised. And of course, we know that the UAE does not hold China in a similar light than the US. And so that's one more concern to bear in mind.
But moving forward, how could that be played out, knowing that we have these allies in the region and there are these deals, but then how could we make sure that to prevent a scenario like Turkey from happening with other countries?
Right. So number one is I think we need to have a very realistic conversation about who's an ally and who is not. The Turks have not been an ally for a very long time, and yet we continue to treat them as if they were. And I think that has been a very unhealthy approach to American foreign policy. But then there's also the question of what systems can the United States sell, or what things can the Israelis provide in remuneration for deals that are signed, peace deals that are made, but that fall short of the F-35 and that don't threaten Israel's qualitative military edge and that wouldn't blow back on the United States. And there are other aircraft, there are missile defense systems, there are homeland security systems, there's other technology that can be provided. And I think it would probably create fewer headaches for everyone involved. But of course, the UAE has the money, and they have leadership that is very smitten with Air Force aircraft. And so this is, I think, creating a problem for the United States now, again, particularly because of the economic challenges that we face and what kind of boost this might provide for the US. But that could, at the end of the day, be a very short-term way of thinking about this. Again, looking at Iran as a prime example, that we sold aircraft to the Iranians and they still remain a core part of their Air Force, antiquated as it may be, they still have American aircraft. It's just a sign that today's allies may not necessarily be allies again in the future.
Now, the people who are watching the elections, many are hoping for a second term for the Trump administration. Many of these people are people who are living under this type of regimes that we were just talking about. If we're talking about foreign policy, the Iranian people, for example, there are people, in other countries, also people in Hong Kong, in Venezuela, who would want to have a strong American administration, a tough administration that is not going to basically stand back and not confront our adversaries. So I just want to ask you, what do you think a second Trump administration would look like in terms of foreign policy? Are we going to see a continuation of the Iran policy?
I think the answer is probably yes. Although I think we also need to note that the Trump administration, in particular, President Trump, has been very unpredictable. It's very difficult to know what he is going to tweet, let alone do on most days. And so there is a concern, for example, that Donald Trump could decide to engage directly with the Iranian people and try to negotiate a deal, and that such a deal may not go far enough. And so there are those that worry about this. I would guess that the Palestinians, for example, right, they have been on the outs with the Trump administration. But if Trump wins, there is a very strong possibility that they would come hat in hand and agree to negotiate with the Trump administration. And you could see a deal there that supporters of Israel may not like, or even some of Israel's new partners in the Gulf may think is too generous. So I think there are always there is the possibility for change. with a Trump administration. The president, as I said, is very unpredictable. But overall, I think the approach toward some of the more repressive regimes around the world has been tough, and I would consider the Trump administration somewhat reliable in its efforts to continue to challenge those regimes where possible.
In terms of a Biden administration, and I know this episode is just going to be a lot of just guessing. Also, we saw how Erdogan is lenient towards, supporting a Trump administration, while the Kurds, for example, in Syria, are more pro a Biden administration because of this kind of tendency to be a little bit more, there's like the relationship between President Trump and Erdogan. How do you view that playing out in a Biden administration?
I think you raise a good point in general that you have these sort of adversaries on the world stage, and they've chosen a candidate, right? Because one has been more accommodating, the other one has been less accommodating, whatever it is. And I think that the broader point to take away here at this point is that I think America needs to return to a more centrist foreign policy. That we have allies, adversaries, enemies around the world that are watching and hoping for a change, a swing back in a different direction. It didn't used to be this way. It used to be that US foreign policy was relatively stable. Yes, we would see a new president come in and shake things up on the margins, but our general approach to rogue states was very similar. Our general approach to sanctions, very similar. You occasionally had something like Nixon in China where, the entire paradigm was turned upside down, but you didn't have so much of this pendulum effect where you swing from pro-Israel to anti-Israel or, engaging with Iran to sanctioning Iran. It's a bit too, it's too much. There's too much change, I think, from one administration to the other. And I think it's actually yielded a temptation on the part of some of these countries to try to influence us. Whether
And
it's
there are
Erdogan,
reports about China and Iran trying to influence the elections towards Biden.
that's right. And you have, we've had good indication that the Turks have mounted a significant effort to woo the Trump administration and to engage there. And it's because they see this daylight. And I think that if we had a more centrist foreign policy, one that didn't swing wildly in one direction or another, these countries wouldn't feel the urge, wouldn't think they might be able to get away with that kind of activity. And so I think there is a lesson to be learned from it. Of course, finding that centrist place it's easier said than done. But I think, again, important lessons to be learned.
Finally, Jonathan, if you could share with us your thoughts about, the future in our relations with a country like Iraq, which the United States is still there, but we still have the Iranian threats, the Iranian militias who are threatening our American forces there, but also abandoning Iraq. We saw what happened, which is what happened under the Obama administration. We also have Syria, where Iran is heavily involved, and Hezbollah and Lebanon. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think all good questions. I think Syria is just a really tough problem. And I haven't seen anybody from either side, Republican or Democrat, come up with solutions that I think are enduring or will ultimately solve the problem over there, which really does stem from the Assad regime and the support that it gets from Iran. So we have sanctions from the Trump administration, but a decision to try to draw down. It's unclear what the what a Biden administration might do that would overturn that. I think we might see more of the same because of the lack of viable options out there. Iraq is a more interesting story only because I still think that there is an opportunity for the US to engage and to pull that country out of the clutches of the regime. But again, it will require us to not be isolationist in nature. It would require us to engage and to use our diplomatic and military strength as well, not necessarily to wage conflict, but to ensure that others in the region understand that we're there and that we're not leaving. Lebanon is, I think, probably the most interesting problem set right now, because of course, the Lebanese government is something like $90 billion in debt. It is having a protracted political crisis. with Hezbollah representing a major player in the government. And then there's, of course, the military challenge that could pop up at any given day, with the Israelis potentially needing to intervene to remove precision-guided munitions from the country, which would almost certainly mean war. What I see actually that's very disconcerting is that neither the Democrats or Republicans are willing to talk tough with the Lebanese and to push the Lebanese armed forces, for example, to remove Hezbollah or Hezbollah munitions. Everyone is so afraid of seeing a civil war erupt that we continue to handle Lebanon with kid gloves. My hope, anyway, is that if a Biden administration comes in, that they'll say that it's time to finally take the reins. And even if the Trump administration comes back for a second term, they might say, well, we have a little bit more freedom now to deal with this issue. But I do believe that with Lebanon, we're running out of time. And that is a dangerous thing, because as time starts to run out, people tend to make more rash decisions. And I think that it's finally time, I think, to deal with the instability, the military challenges, the financial challenges. They need to be dealt with, and they need to be dealt with soon.
How? If you don't mind me, I know you have to run, but how? How could we do that?
Well, I mean, one is using the leverage that we have with the Lebanese armed forces, that they, we don't say that we want them to get into a war with Hezbollah, but even to say that it's time to remove the precision-guided munitions and other dangerous weapons from the country that don't belong to the military. Well, seems like a fairly core statement that that the LAF should be able to deliver. If we're going to issue a bailout or some kind of rescue package, that it should be in exchange for certain concessions from the Lebanese government, again, dealing with the Hezbollah problem, trying to remove it from the politics, trying to, again, deal with the weapons problems that persist. These are things that can be done, but that we refuse to do. Again, some of this has to do with the way that the Lebanese armed forces have been viewed internally here in the US as a partner, as friends. The banks, by the way, that are so responsible for the collapse of the Lebanese system, we continue to treat them as friends as well when they have failed us. And I think it's, just beginning to address some of those issues for the first time could really have some utility.
I'm going to end it here. Thank you so much, Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, for joining us today. Thank you all for listening and watching with you, Havi, and The Untold with Havi Buzo. I would love to hear your thoughts, and please send me your comments, and I'll see you next time.